Okay. All right. To the
Thank you very much, Chairman. Yeah, good evening once more, our cherished listeners and viewers. It's another segment of the radio lecture on the course EDF 111 Foundations of Education. So, I am MIRIAM OGAH from the Department of Educational Foundations, the School of Education and Lifelong Learning. So, I'm privileged to be your lecturer for this particular course, and I'm in the studio with our dear Christiana from the Department of Special Education. She is doing the sign language for us. Yeah. All right. So for those who just joined, this is Radio Windy Bay, and it's another radio lecture series, as said earlier, on EDF 111 Foundations of Education. The topic for today's radio lecture is on historical context of education, part 3, historical context of education. And so quickly, call a friend to call another colleague to join Radio Windy Bay 98.3 FM. We are live on Facebook and the university website via uew.edu.gh and then Facebook at Radio Windy Bay 98.3 FM. The studio line remains 050 392 3158 050 392 3158. All right, so we begin. For the past 3 weeks, it's been history that we have been doing. The very first week of this particular topic, we came your way with the historical context of education in Ghana, part 1, where we looked at traditional pre-colonial education in this country. And we mentioned that the form of education that existed at that time during pre-colonial Ghanaian times was informal education. Then last week, we came your way on this very platform on the historical context of education, part 2, where the topic featured introduction of formal education, i.e. European experience or missionary influence in formal education. Today, and so we looked at the various European missionaries that came to establish, began the education or formal education in this country. We identified some of the missionaries to be the Basel Mission, the Wesleyan Mission, the Catholic Mission, the MIRIAM Mission, and so on and so forth. And so we looked at the curricula that they used. We look at assessment and all those things, education under missionary experience in Ghana. Today, we're moving on to another area which has to do with colonial education in Ghana. So after missionaries' attempt in providing education in this country, it didn't end there. Our colonial masters also tried to establish schools or expand education in this country. And so we'll look at colonial education in Ghana, and then we continue with the other topics in the coming weeks. So quickly, education under colonial, pre-independence, and then post-colonial periods. We begin. In terms of Ghana or the Gold Coast coming under colonial rule, by 1874, we realized that the entire British Crown colony in terms of the Gold Coast, so it has been formally declared as a British Crown colony, meaning that all other parts of the Gold Coast had been annexed under the British Crown. And so initial government participation in education had to do with coming up with certain policies or guidelines in the form of ordinances to guide education in the country. And so before the period 1874, we realized that the Gold Coast had been experiencing series of interstate wars and struggles, battles here and there. But finally, by 74, the Anglo-Ashanti War between Ashanti and then the English, the British, had been settled, and at this time round, we will see that colonization was in a way coming to begin. It is important to note that before this final annexation, there were certain education ordinances that were introduced. So, for example, in 1852, during the time of the governor, Sir Stephen Hill, he proposed certain ordinances as far as the education sector was concerned. And so we can talk about the 1852 ordinance. Now, if we talk of an ordinance, it is an order or rule made by a government or somebody in a position of authority. And so it is more or less a rule, a principle, a guideline that he introduced to guide education in this country. Almost all the ordinances that were introduced, there were certain provisions that were made in them. So, for example, by the 1852 ordinance, education ordinance, it was supposed to be financed through the payment of the poll tax. Through the payment of the poll tax. That is how it was expected that education will be funded in the country. Again, there were other provisions related to promoting child education, promoting girls' education in the country. And so it was entrusted in the hands of Mr. and Mrs. Vinal. They were in charge. But all in all, we will say that we don't want to bore you with much history about all this. So then 1852 education ordinance failed. It collapsed. Why? There were several reasons. One of the reasons were that the poll tax ordinance, where people were levied, and it was expected that we pay so that whatever revenue that is generated from that, we use it to support the provision of education in this country. Unfortunately, we didn't pay as expected. And the little that was paid to, it was embezzled. And so it was one of the reasons that led to that. And if you listened attentively, yes, those who were put in charge of education in this country, Mr. and Mrs. Vinal. Unfortunately, Mrs. Vinal met her untimely death. She died, and the husband also was battling illnesses here and there, so he had to also leave the country. If that happens, those very people that were put in charge, coupled with the fact that the monies to support payment of teachers, provision of materials and all that wasn't forthcoming as expected, then it is likely that the program or the ordinance will collapse. Hence, the failure of the 1852 ordinance. So this actually happened before the annexation of the Gold Coast under British Crown. And so from the period 74, we would see government taking several steps in order to assume direct political control of the country. And so education began to serve colonial administrative needs. It brought about the need for putting certain structures and educational policies in place, just like the education that existed at the time of the castle schools, where it, to a larger extent, served the needs and interests of the traders rather than perhaps empowering the indigenous people. And so in the same line, when the colonial government took over, in fact, the attempts that they made, we could see little expansions here and there, but generally it was meant to serve their colonial administrative purposes in the Gold Coast. And so by 1882, we would come to experience another education ordinance, which we would say was the first of formal government attempt, the first formal government attempt to regulate education in this country. Don't forget that we said by 1874, the entire country or the Gold Coast has come under British Crown colony. And so now they will begin to take pragmatic steps to ensure that they take over almost every asphere, be it political, economic, and what have you, aspects of the Gold Coast. And so education was one aspect that they paid critical attention to. So the 1882 ordinance, we realized that a prominent provision of that particular ordinance was the payment by results. Yes, 1887, the education ordinance that was introduced. What featured prominently in it was the payment by result. And for the 1882 ordinance, one major provision in it was the grant in aid system, which was introduced, whereby for the colonial government to support the missionaries in the provision of education in this country, they gave them certain conditions. For example, to receive a grant from the colonial government, you have to admit students irrespective of their religious affiliation. We shouldn't forget the fact that prior to the colonial government coming in to support education, education was predominantly in the hands of the missionaries. And so, like we discussed, you would realize that to gain certain benefits from the missionaries, you have to either convert. And so those who probably converted to the Presbyterian faith, the Methodist faith, the Catholic faith, any benefit at all, they consider their convents first before any other. But with the coming in of the colonial government, they said, yes, we will continue to support you. However, it should no longer necessarily be based on the people that fellowship or convert to your faith. So if you are able to provide admission to the indigenous people generally, irrespective of whether they belong to your faith or not, then we will support you. And so we will see that these two ordinances equally failed. Talking about the payment by results, which was introduced in the 1887 ordinance, you would see that. So we are talking about the performance of students, okay, the results of students, whatever result the student attained at the end of the term. Based on that, that was how teachers were paid. And so what that meant was that if at the end of the day the students failed, it means that the teacher had failed. And so the teacher failed to assist or help the students to meet the minimum requirements. And so the teacher could be denied his or her little that is due him or her. And so this created a kind of enmity between the inspectors of the schools and the teachers. Because, yes, we understand that sometimes probably certain teachers could serve as contributory factors to the failure of students. But to totally say that whenever students fail, it is the fault of the teacher, I believe that if it were to be in our current dispensation this is not something that we will laud the government for. So because of this and other reasons, you realize that this one also failed. And from this, it promoted a kind of rote learning where students were memorized because the teacher had to make sure that the students pass. So how are they going to pass? It wasn't necessarily through the mastery of skills and competencies, but their ability to commit certain things to memory and pour them where necessary. And so it really encouraged that. But all in all, we're saying that these two education ordinances equally failed, just like the earlier one, the 1852 ordinance. So, in fact, those were not the only education ordinances that were introduced prior to the independence era. By 1925, Sir Frederick Gordon Gajesberg introduced the 1925 Education Ordinance. The 1925 Education Ordinance. If you read further on Gajesberg's 16 Principles of Education, you will come across a number of provisions that were made. He made provisions for primary education, for secondary education, which led to the establishment of Achimota College, for university education. In fact, a whole lot. So by 1925, we will see that education sought to provide a kind of comprehensive policies to guide all this period that we were under colonial rule. Again, the 1925 ordinance emphasized quality education. We have been preaching quality education ever since. Yes, teacher training, secondary, technical and vocational education, and so on and so forth. All right. So for purposes of those who just joined, this is Radio Windy Bay, and we are having a radio lecture on the course EDF 111. The topic is historical context of education, the historical context of education in Ghana. Yes, so we've looked at the part 3, of course. So in today's lecture, we're looking at education under colonial, pre-independence, and then post-independent period. So basically, we are looking at education under the colonial period. And we said that under colonial period, series of education ordinances were introduced in the Gold Coast. Talking of the 1852 ordinance, the 1882 ordinance, 87 ordinance, 1925 Gajesberg's ordinance, and all these ordinances that were introduced, there were certain provisions that were made in them. We've identified earlier ones that failed, with issues related to lack of funds, with issues related to the death and ill health of some of the people who were put in charge, and so on and so forth. And so you can keep your questions and your comments coming on 050-392-3158. All right, so we proceed. On the purpose of British colonial education. Why did the colonial masters, or why did the British try to take part in the provision of formal education in this country? What was their purpose for taking keen interest of education in this country? Yes, we mentioned earlier that when they sought interest in education, they tried to kind of introduce certain policies or guidelines that will serve their colonial interests. And so first of all, we will see that they had interest in training clerks, interpreters, administrators, those people that at the end of the day were likely to assist them in colonizing us, those who will help them serving as clerks, serving as interpreters. We shouldn't forget that the issue of language barrier was there, so they needed people to read, to write, to interpret certain things with it, to help them keep records and all that. And so for this reason, they had interest in education in the Gold Coast. We can talk about the need to promote obedience and loyalty, for people to be very loyal to the colonial authority. Promotion of obedience and loyalty to colonial authority. And so the learning areas, the curriculum that we shall look at very soon, we'll see some of these things featured in. Again, we can talk of the need, their interest for us to support their economic exploitation, and then to prevent over-education of the masses. Yes, education, just like it was limited under the missionaries or during the establishment of the castle schools, we will see that
This is Radio Windy Bay, Windy Bay 98.3 FM.
All right. So the purpose of British colonial education in this country, first of all, we've mentioned that there was a need for
This is Radio Windy Bay, Windy Bay 98.3 FM. This is Radio Windy Bay, Windy Bay 98.3 FM.
Yeah. All right. Sorry out there. So like I was saying, the purpose of British colonial education in Ghana, there was the urgent need to train those who will serve as interpreters, those who will serve as clerks, as administrators, and so on and so forth. We had to train some of our own people over here. There was a need to train some of the indigents to assist the colonial masters in their attempt in terms of all their activities in the Gold Coast. And so they had to take interest in that. Secondly, the need to promote obedience. And as a matter of fact, the need that we have to be very loyal to the British Crown. And so some of the content areas that were studied by way of the curriculum, we will see some of these elements or developments there. To support economic exploitation and then governance. Yes, so this amongst other reasons, the British decided to take part in providing formal education in this country. The structure of British colonial education system was such that generally, elementary education was to be attained at the mission schools. Generally, the missionaries were still, they continued with the provision of elementary education in this country. In terms of secondary education, we saw a little expansion in there, and then few opportunities were provided for higher education. If you read through Gettysburg's 16 Principles on Education, we'll find some of these provisions featuring in that. And so during the British colonial era administration, there was expansion in terms of schools, but it is important to know that there were some limitations. It was selective in nature. It wasn't designed for the mass empowerment of the indigenous people. They limited it, just like it was limited under the castle schools. You know, education is one of the tools that empowers an individual. And so they try to limit it so that at the end of the day, we do not come and then who knows, use that against them. So that was their initial attempt. Now, we would, let's look at the curriculum that was used under colonial rule. Generally, so we are putting all of them together, not in terms of, for each of the ordinances that were introduced, we will see the learning areas, the content and all that in terms of the provisions. But generally, if we put all of them together, they all sought to be singing these songs. For example, we will see what is termed the 3 R's, all the education ordinances that were introduced during the colonial era. Reading, writing, and arithmetic featured prominently in all of them. We refer to them as the 3 R's: reading, writing, there is an R in writing. Arithmetic, there is an R in it. So reading, writing, arithmetic. English language as the official language, as the medium of instruction in schools. Little attention was paid to the local languages. Again, the curriculum that was used, we will see that local people were studying British geography, British English, history, and their culture. So they weren't only learning about the reading, writing, arithmetic, but almost everything, the geography of Great Britain, the history, and then the culture of the people, including what they eat, what they wear, the language, and almost everything. So they introduced that in our content over here. At that time, they didn't emphasize the teaching of science and technical education. Issues related to examinations and certifications, it really featured in the curriculum. And so in terms of the curriculum that was used under colonial rule, generally these were some of the content areas: reading, writing, arithmetic, the use of English as a medium of instruction. Yeah, the local languages were taught, but they didn't really emphasize that much compared to the rate at which English language was on top. Then issues related to the geography, the history of Britain, they were studying it. Science and technical education, not really. They didn't pay attention to it that much. Issues related to examinations, both external and internal examinations, it featured prominently. And at the end of the day, certificates were awarded at each of the levels of education. And so in terms of that, yes, historical context of education in Ghana. We want to activate the phone lines as early as possible so that your questions, your comments, we can keep them coming. So stay tuned, keep writing them. Very soon, the phone line will be activated. It is 050-392-3158. All right, so all these attempts by the British, they didn't really have any limitations on in Ghana. Yes, limitations of colonial education, they didn't really affect us negatively. Yes, in terms of access, like we have said, it was limited. And so they didn't open it up for anybody at all who was interested to take part. They really limited it in terms of accessing basic education. Yes, it was academic and bookish in nature, examination focused. They didn't pay attention to practical skills, so almost everything was theoretical in nature. And at the end of the day, it promoted rote learning. Local needs, indigenous knowledge and beliefs were neglected. Yes, when we were learning about British culture, their geography and all that, what is indigenous knowledge going to do out there? No. They paid little attention to it, or if not totally neglected. In terms of class stratification, yes, so those who had some form of colonial education, or those who had formal education, they saw themselves to be at the top. And then those who did not get opportunity to benefit from this formal education, they were seen to be at the bottom. So they created a kind of social stratification, a class system, which isn't something that is so good for us as a nation to cherish. All right. I believe at this time we can activate the phone lines, or if there are messages on Facebook or the university website, we can attend to some of them whilst we continue with the lecture. All right.
This is Radio Windy. 98.3 FM.
This is Radio Windy Bay 98.3 FM. Follow us on our various social media handles. On Facebook is Radio Windy Bay 98.3 FM or Instagram Radio Windy Bay 98.3 FM. Twitter at Windy Bay 983 FM. YouTube is Radio Windy Bay 98.3 FM. WhatsApp and text us on 0503 923 158 or contact us on 050 3923 158 or 033-2320-201 or 033-2322-499. You can listen to us on our website www.uaw.edu.gh. Radio Windy Bay, the ultimate in-campus radio.
Oh, we can. 050-392-3158 050-392-3158. It's still the radio lecture on EDF 111 Foundations of Education. All right, so far we've looked at education under colonial, and so we're going to look at the pre-independence period. How was education like just before we attained independence? So by the late 1940s, nationalist movements were growing, not only in Ghana, but in some parts of Africa. So we see the formation of nationalist movements like the UGCC, the formation of political parties, UGCC, CPP, the National Congress of British West Africa had also been formed. A series of nationalist movements were formed, all with the aim of attaining independence. All right, so the UGCC, the CPP, they were all fighting. A series of movements were formed with the aim of attaining independence. And so by this time, by the late 1940s, Africans were now demanding for self-government from the British. And so there was that urgent need for educated manpower. We needed people. If you are demanding for self-government, then of course, if we attain independence, we are supposed to take charge of almost every sphere of our lives in this country, be it our economic life, our political life, religious, scientific, what have you. And so there was the need for us to quickly educate, expand. So we will see education expanding so that we can have enough skilled persons to man various sectors of the economy should we attain independence. Hello, do we have a caller? Okay, all right. So by 1951, education before 1951, actually, in the education in the Gold Coast, as has been said, was slow in terms of expansion. It was elitist in nature. It was centered. Hello, your name and your department, please. Good evening.
My name is Thomas.
Please kindly speak louder.
Please, my name is Thomas.
Thomas, good.
Please, my question is, what major
Your department.
Yes, I said it. My question is, what major development does Georgisburg governor influence the local needs?
What major development?
Yeah, does Georgisburg governor influence the local needs?
Okay. So just stay tuned, you will be addressed. What major developments that Georgisburg's governance have on local needs? So yes, this one we are looking at it in terms of his developments were many, but we are looking at it in terms of his educational expansion. And so that is it. When it comes to the building of schools, we mentioned the expansion of secondary education, university, college, and other areas. So he contributed in a way. All right. So yes, like I was saying, education in the Gold Coast was slow in expansion. It was concentrated at the urban areas, and to a larger extent, it was controlled by the missionaries and colonial authorities. And so access to education was limited, especially for those who were at the rural areas. So children at the rural areas, naturally, should we say, they were denied of formal education. Those who were from poor families, and then even girls, yes, they had limited access to formal education. And as has been mentioned earlier, the curriculum mainly served colonial administrative needs, the needs of the colonial authorities. And so by after the 1951 general elections, we will see that for the first time we had an African-led government. So this government was led by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. And so he introduced what he termed the Accelerated Development Plan of 1951. It was introduced just after he had won the 1951 general elections. And so we will see rapid expansion in terms of educational access in the Gold Coast, because this is something that we have been wishing for. We shouldn't forget that since the demand for self-government, there was a need to use education as a tool to empower our own people, so that we can, when our freedom is entrusted in our hands, we wouldn't find anything challenging in terms of spearheading almost every development or sector. And so quickly he expanded education, not only by establishment of schools, in terms of enrollment. So we will see that enrollment also increased, and this brought about a number of improvements in the lives of the indigenous or Ghanaians. The free compulsory universal basic education or primary education policy was introduced. Teacher training was expanded. There was increase in school enrollment nationwide. Okay, hello, dear, your name and your department.
I'm Emmanuel Bachamango from the accounting.
Emmanuel Accounting, okay.
So my question is, the broadcast ordinance, you said it was collapsed or it was destroyed. So like, I want to know whether this specific is so bad.
You want to know whether what?
I have a reason on that, so I want to know whether it's so.
Okay. Yes, so your contribution is welcome.
My reason is, can you say that the broadcast ordinance in 1852 was destroyed due to the unfairness of the tax collectors?
You want to look at it in terms of the tax collectors paying the money, but it wasn't getting into the hands of. Oh yes. Is that what? Yeah, that was possible, because we're talking about embezzlement over there. So at the end of the day, what the money was expected to be used for, it couldn't get into the right hands. So that possibility was also there.
Okay.
All right.
Thanks.
You are welcome. Do we have? Hello. Your name and your department, please.
Accounting education.
Accounting education. Okay.
Yeah. Please, during the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan, please, was there any foreign aid from the European countries?
Okay, I think a number of calls are coming, so yeah, we'll be noting down the questions and then I'll address them at the right time. Okay, do we have another one? All right. Okay, so on the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan.
Hello.
Yes. Hello, your name and your department.
Hello.
Hello. Hello, yes. Your name and your department. Please, kindly move away. Some people are making noise around you.
Hello.
Hello, yes.
Good evening, Doc.
Good evening.
Please, my name is Adela from the English department.
Okay.
All right. I'm confused about something.
Okay.
The ordinances, let's say that of 1882, the grant in aid, and then 1887, payment by result. All these also happened before independence, and now we are having the Increment Accelerated Development Plan being referred to as some of the policies that happened before independence. So I don't know how to classify the 1882 and then the 1887. I don't know how to term them.
Okay.
Can't those ones to be termed as ordinances that occurred before independence?
Okay. Okay, so how you need to get it is that from 1951, okay?
Okay.
That is where for the first time, so that is why we began with the fact that from 1940, don't worry, we'll address that, okay? Okay, so I'll address so that we can answer another caller.
Okay, all right. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, we've lost that. Okay, so with the issue of, I think that let me address this once before we...
Hello.
Hello, your name and your department?
Good evening.
Good evening.
My name is Chifa Nijubanjos from the OGAH department.
Okay.
My question here is that during the pre-colonial era, you say, according to your teachings, you say they were teaching geography, history, and culture. Were they including this in economics?
The geography, history, and whatever the subjects that you had, British, that was a British one, not Ghanaian. Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello.
Hello. Your name and your department. Good evening.
Please, I'm Frederick Abuaji.
Okay.
From Political Science Department.
Okay.
Please, I want to ask if the education that were brought after the colonial masters are here. I want to ask if those who are challenged physically, they were also included in the education, as the girls were allowed to enroll in the education.
Whether girls were allowed? Okay, I will address that. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Let me continue with this before we let me answer these few phone calls before. All right. So to take it from our friend from political science, yes, in terms of the girls, if you look at, so this is in connection with the question that was posed, I think, by one imam from the accounting or so department, in terms of the significant things that were introduced in Gagisberg's 16 principles of education. He made mention of the fact that there was a need to provide equal opportunities. So equal opportunities needed to be made for both boys and girls in terms of education. I think in the earlier one too, some of the things that Gagisberg did, yes, in terms of religious training forming part of school life, in terms of the staff of teachers needed to be of highest possible quality. He made provisions for all this, that sufficient staff of effective African inspectors of schools must be trained to help maintain discipline. The provision for secondary education, for a university, and so on and so forth. And so, yes, in Gagisberg's 1925 education ordinance, a lot of, should we say, important provisions were made in it, which most of them were lived to see the light of day. Then,
hello, George.
Yeah, hello, your name and your department, please. Hello.
Hello, George.
Yes.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Please, my name is Benjamin.
All right, Benjamin.
Okay, please. I want to ask, God is back in 1919 to 1927. Can I say that his education has shaped Ghana education as of now?
Yes, because we will see some of the current developments in our education sectors taking inspiration from Gagisberg's own. So yes, he contributed his quota. Yes. I think the call that came from... Hello, your name and your department, please.
My name is Timothy from the Geography Department.
Okay, Timothy.
Okay, so please, my question is, last week we looked at the coming of the Europeans when they came here and the time they started their education.
Yeah.
So I want to know whether the coming of the Europeans, when they came here, do they have any idea of Africa to come and trade? Or they were looking for a route to the Far East?
So this one, if we want to look at it, then we are moving more into the history of it, okay, which does not necessarily fall within the context of this. You realize that there were several reasons for the coming of the Europeans. Economic reasons, scientific reasons, like you are saying, a route to the Far East, scientific exploration. So there were several reasons for that. Let's situate it within context so that some of our colleagues may not get confused. Even with the history of this particular education, we are trying to limit it in a way, okay? So this one falls outside, it falls out of context. At the end of the day, we established right from the beginning that the idea for not necessarily the coming of the Europeans, but in terms of trade, that was the main reason why they came. So when they try to venture into education, then we will see that those form of education that they provided, so that at the end of the day, the people that they educated will come and then serve them or benefit them. That was what they did. That was the intention. The main reasons, like you have mentioned, a route leading to the Far East, it was one of their scientific reasons for coming. But we are concentrating on the fact that they came here, and the main reason was to trade. Along the line, education had to come in. All right. Okay. I think there was a notable one from Linda saying that, yes, we have mentioned a number of education ordinances from 1852, 1882, 1887, up to 1951 that we are approaching independence. You see, the reason is that, yes, all these things happened before independence, but every era and the atmosphere, let me bring it down to a level that you want, every era and what happens or what pertains. During the period, the 18th, whatever that these ordinances were introduced, at that time, the idea for self-government wasn't ringing a bell in the eyes of the indigents. Hello.
Hello.
Hello, your name and your department?
Please, I'm Owusu Bennett from Political Science Department.
All right.
Please, I want to ask now started the colonial education. I mean the formal education.
Which what?
Governor.
Okay, started colonial education.
Yes, please.
I think it was mentioned. I mentioned it. So you have to go back and listen to the live feedback.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so let's hold on. We are holding on with the course. We'll come back. We'll activate the phone lines again so that we can address these ones. Okay, I think Linda from the English department wanted to know all these dates and ordinances that have been mentioned. They all happened before independence in 1957. So why are we putting them under pre-independence and colonial era and all that? Yes, I started by explaining that every era and what pertains. In this early or late 18s, 1882, 87, in fact, the idea of self-government wasn't something that the people of the Gold Coast had even thought of. So we'll see that it was from the late 1940s that the idea of trying to get self-government came in. That is why we said that, okay, so those developments that took place from the middle or the late 1940s going, they can better be placed under education before independence. That is why it is there. We understand that all these days they all preceded the independence era, but that is how it is. Every year or every period or era and what the atmosphere looks like, what the people demanded for, and so on and so forth. Okay, if how you want it to look like is anything to go by, then we'll continue. Okay, let me not go there for others to get confused. All right. Then, yes, I think almost all of them has been addressed. All right. Let's continue with the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan on Education. So for the first time, we've had an African-led government led by Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. So the ADP was introduced, which witnessed a rapid expansion in education throughout the Gold Coast. So more schools were established, enrollment increased, the children at the rural areas now had the opportunity, and so on and so forth. So it brought a kind of greater state control over schools, and it reduced missionary dominance to make education a public responsibility. Now it was our own responsibility, because we've had an African leader, a Ghanaian for that matter, we leading our own governance. And so this laid the foundation. The 1951 ADP laid the foundation for Ghana's post-independence education systems. After independence in 1957, we still experience a number of educational reforms, and all these educational reforms that were introduced got some inspiration from the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan on Education. That is not to say that the ADP didn't suffer any challenges. There were challenges. For the first time that schools had been established, had been expanded, access to education had now been expanded. So we'll see a lot of people rushing. And so issue of overcrowding was a serious challenge. And secondly, teacher shortages. As soon as enrollment increases, of course, there will be more teachers, more hands will be needed so that we could get enough teachers to teach in the various schools and classrooms. And so one of the major challenges as far as education was concerned was that there was overcrowding in the schools and there were teacher shortages. So we need to bear that in mind. It had to take some time for us to train more teachers to help in solving these particular challenges. All right. And so Kwame Nkrumah's vision for education was that he saw education as a tool for nation building. Education, there was a need for us to get skilled people. Our own people needed to be very skillful when it comes to mining almost every area of our economy, our political life, our social life, and what have you. And so he was much interested in trying to make Africanized education in a way that at the end of the day, those who go through the school system, they will be in a better position to manage, as he popularly said, the African is capable of managing his own affairs. And so he saw education to be a very powerful tool, because he himself, he was a testament of that. He had attained formal education, not only in Ghana. He had traveled far and wide to learn and then study. He knew what was happening. And so he had that strong desire to make sure that he expanded the education sector in this country so that we will all feel empowered. And so some of the, after 1957, after independence, for example, most of the reforms that were introduced at the education sector focus again on access. So that is why I said earlier that right from the other reforms that were introduced after independence, they all took inspiration from the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan in terms of access, for example, equity, and the relevance of education. Is it to benefit us? Is it to empower us? Or to make us, quote unquote, slaves to a certain group of people? In terms of expansion, secondary education, tertiary education, so here we will see a number of Ghana secondary schools that were established in this country. Talking about universities, teacher training institutions, we saw massive expansions and developments in them after 1957. And so for purposes, I'm sure some also just joined us, we're still having a radio lecture on EDF 111, Historical Context of Education in Ghana, the part 3, which focuses on education under colonial rule, education before independence, and then probably post-independence. You can keep your questions coming on Facebook and other the university website so that we address them as and when the need arises. All right. The 1961 Education Act. The 1961 Education Act, it gave a kind of legal backing to the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan. Now, education had become a right and not necessarily a privilege to the few privileged ones in society. There was a need for this ruling so that everybody will find, every child of school-going age, it was now a right that that child received education, formal education for that matter. All right, we can activate the, or let's see if there are certain questions on Facebook so that we address those ones before.
Iconic initiate.
good evening once more. We've been having a radio lecture on EDF 111, the historical context of education in Ghana, and in today's lecture, we emphasize education under colonial system, i.e. under British rule. So the series of educational ordinances that were passed right from 1852 through to 1925. Then we looked at some of the education ordinances or reforms too. From 1951, the Accelerated Development Plan on Education, and then after the independence era and so on and so forth. So it's important to note that in all these ordinances, attempts were made to improve on education in a way, though some of these earlier ordinances failed. Formal education didn't totally fail in the Gold Coast. There were certain improvements here and there until when in the period 1951, Kwame Nkrumah was elected into office. He took the pragmatic step to rapidly expand formal education in this country, and it is seen, that could be seen in the number of schools that were built, which were not vacant. School enrollment increased, and of course there were certain challenges, but steps were taken to address these challenges related to teacher shortages, and so the teacher training allowances were introduced so that people would be encouraged or enthused to go to attend the training college, come back, and then teach in our various schools. Enrollment increase. So education has existed without, for all this, there are certain challenges. Even currently we are facing challenges, but of course governments day in day out take the necessary steps to provide certain solutions to these areas. So as far as education in this country is concerned, this is how far we have come, right from education from the African perspective or the pre-colonial Ghanaian perspective, where informal education was the order of the day. Then along the line, we came into contact with the Western world. Formal education began at the castle schools. Then missionaries also played a role. They took over the castle schools, because along the line we learned that the castle schools equally collapsed due to reasons related to trade going down and all that. So the missionaries took the lead. They continued with the foundations that were laid. Some were facing their untimely death, but it didn't end there until finally in 1874 the entire Gold Coast was annexed under the British Crown. That is where we will see the British government taking serious steps in promoting education in this country. Even in all these areas, it has been established that education was still limited until the period 1951 onwards, where we will see massive expansions. 1925, Gettysburg's ordinance saw some kind of expansion, but it wasn't rapid or massive as compared to the 1951 Accelerated Development Plan that was introduced. For the first time, education was rapidly expanded, and ever since that period, we keep seeing increase in enrollment in our various schools. So for today's lecture, in terms of education, the history of education in this country, this is where we came from, and this is how far we have come, and then we are still making a headway. Same time next week, we shall meet you on a different topic, philosophical foundations of education, on this same platform. So stay tuned. Have a good evening.
So if you dream big, all of the courses we run it. LKU, you know, we got it. We own it and we're proud of it. So in our heart, it's your name.